All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Unraveling Personal Conveyance Changes. We are now in our third year of this webinar series, so stay tuned for more information about upcoming webinars as as the new months come and approach. Today, we're welcoming John Sallak as our guest speaker today. He's a renowned voice in trucking safety and is retired from years of service at the Oregon Trucking Association. Before we begin, I do want to mention that there's a couple webinar housekeeping items. The webinar today is scheduled for an hour, so phones will be muted during the webinar. If you have any questions, please type them up in the chat box. If we have time, I might be able to even unmute people if you have questions during the Q&A time. There is going to be a Q&A time. We'll address your questions. The webinar may or may not go in a whole hour, but just wanted to give the whole hour just space for us to be able to chat if there's a lot of questions. This webinar is also being recorded. You will receive this presentation and a link of the recording after the webinar. Because it's Friday, expect an email out in your inboxes on Monday. With that, we're going to dive in. Again, we're going to be discussing personal conveyance. Late last year, there was a lot of new guidance that came out, and it's been causing a lot of discussion on personal conveyance with these changes. And we're going to help you know what to do and how to stay in compliance. So with that, again, thank you, John, for joining us, and you can take it away.
Okay, thank you, Luke. Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. As Luke said, we're going to be talking specifically about electronic logging devices where personal conveyance becomes a factor. And a little bit of the regulatory background. We're dealing with regulations that are published in what's called the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 49. We'll be talking about things that are published in Part 395. I mention this to you because if you should ever want to look at some of these things, especially this particular guidance that we'll be discussing, you can easily find it just by searching and going onto the internet and search for Title 49 CFR Part 395. It will take you into that section, and that is the hours of service section for commercial motor vehicles. It will also take you to several interpretations or guidances. These are questions that have been asked of the agency at some point about a specific use of a specific rule. And the agency will take it under consideration and then publish a regulatory guidance. So if you will look at the screen with me here, we're in Part 395. We're dealing with driver's hours of service and the recently required electronic logging devices, the ELD. Now, a portion of the regulation makes reference to the use of traveling in off-duty status, and that is called personal conveyance. The guidance that I have mentioned is in question number 26, and that would be where you would go if you make your search. And you can get the entire text then of the regulatory guidance. Now, personal conveyance, not under that name, but under different terms, has been around for a long time because the question was asked years ago in a guidance type question: how can I travel home from the truck stop? How can I travel from the truck stop to a hotel? How can I take some personal time in the truck and not have to log my hours? And there was a guidance that was issued for that, and it's been changed quite a bit now recently in the guidance that came out late last year. And so that's what we'll be looking at, is this guidance, how it instructs us to be able to use personal conveyance. So we're looking at a slide now that defines personal conveyance, and it's the movement of a commercial motor vehicle for personal use while off duty. And as you all know, when we're operating commercial motor vehicles and we're responsible for creating a daily log, that we have to show all of our time, and we have to show it either as off duty or in a sleeper berth, or driving, or off-duty not driving. Those are our four choices. what we would like to do at times, and that's the reason for this term, personal conveyance, we would like to be able to save some of those driving hours by going off duty if our travel is for personal use. So our definition again, the movement of a commercial motor vehicle for personal use while off duty. So a driver can record hours of service time operating a commercial motor vehicle for conveyance as off-duty only when the driver is relieved from work and all responsibility for performing work by the motor carrier. They have to be totally free to engage in activities of their own choosing. Personal conveyance does not reduce the driver's obligation or the company's obligation and responsibility to operate a commercial motor vehicle safely. The reason this statement is in the guidance is because quite often we all know that we have to take 10 hours off duty, 10 consecutive hours off duty to get some proper recuperative rest in order to be able to drive safely again the next day. Well, in that 10-hour period could be some periods of driving under personal conveyance. So in those 10 hours, you might not really be resting all of that time because you may be driving your commercial vehicle as a personal vehicle. Keep in mind, though, that you always have that obligation to be properly rested before you drive again. Now, a motor carrier can establish limitations within the scope of this guidance, so they can even be more restrictive. And in fact, some motor carriers are deciding not to allow their drivers to use personal conveyance. That is the company's choice. It may be a wise decision in some areas where maybe there are a lot of occasions for error or for abuse of personal conveyance. We also see many motor carriers limiting the distance or the amount of time that the driver may go off duty using personal conveyance. And that decision might be based on the fact that a reasonable amount of time might be 30 minutes or it might be 20 or 30 miles. And so limitations can be established by the company, and the drivers must adhere to those limitations. They become company rules by policy. So the real meat and potatoes of this thing is, when can we use personal conveyance legally? And I have to tell you that if you're not using it legally, if it's being abused, if you're trying to be off duty when you shouldn't be off duty, in terms of an audit by the DOT or a roadside inspection by some officer, agent representing the DOT, improper use of personal conveyance could be determined to be a falsified log. And that's a pretty serious violation at the roadside. And it's certainly very serious if you do have a compliance review, an audit from the DOT. So these are appropriate uses of driving off duty in the personal conveyance mode. The first one is any time spent traveling from the driver's en route lodging, such as a motel or truck stop, to a restaurant or an entertainment facility. So if the truck stop, for example, is where the driver's staying, but there is no place to eat, they can go in a reasonable distance. They can go somewhere else and find food and eat and return, and that would be considered personal conveyance. The next one is commuting between the driver's terminal and his or her residence, or between trailer drop lots and the driver's residence, and between work sites and the driver residence. So it's acceptable to drive from the terminal at the end of the trip, at the end of the day, free of any responsibility to the company, and drive home. That's allowed. If the driver is leaving a trailer somewhere at a truck stop or a company drop lot, that driver may then drive off duty as personal conveyance to his or her residence. The third one in this slide is time spent traveling to a nearby reasonable safe location to obtain retired rest after loading or unloading. The time driving under personal conveyance must allow the driver adequate time to obtain the required rest. There's a story we've heard for some time now, for 2 or 3 years, and that was about a driver in a situation on the East Coast who drove all night or most of the night to get to the point where he would start driving under load. but he had driven all night already, and then there was a crash, and it involved a fatality and an injury to another party. And this driver was deemed to have really seriously abused a personal conveyance type situation by driving all night when he really should have been getting a few hours of sleep. So we want to be careful with this, but time spent traveling to a nearby reasonable safe location to obtain required rest after loading or unloading is acceptable. As an example, we may unload at a warehouse in Portland, Oregon, and now we want to go someplace just to park and maybe take our 10 hours off in a sleeper berth. The driver has the right to drive to a safe place where the truck can be parked legally and safely, and the driver can get a decent rest period after parking. So we've talked about three of several opportunities where we can use personal conveyance. And again, later when we're finished here, if there are questions, if they aren't clear, hopefully we can address those at that time. Some additional appropriate uses of personal conveyance. One of them is time spent traveling in a motor coach without passengers to en route lodging, such as a motel or truck stop, or to a restaurant or entertainment facility, and then back to the lodging. I don't know if we have any motor carriers on this call today who transport passengers, but this would be a critical piece for someone who is driving a motor coach. As long as there are no passengers, then the driver can go off duty when he drives the motor coach to lodging, to a restaurant, and so on. Any time spent transporting personal property while off duty is considered personal conveyance. This might be a situation where you own the truck, or the company has allowed you to use the truck on a weekend, for example, to move some furniture. Well, if you're moving that furniture, you're on your own, you're totally off duty, that time can be called personal conveyance. With an ELD on board, it will be logged, and so you have to be careful to code it properly as personal conveyance. And another opportunity would be authorized use of a commercial motor vehicle to travel home after working at an off-site location. Someone who's based in Seattle, Washington might be sent to Ellensburg, Washington to work for several days. But the distance between that off-site location and home is reasonable enough that the company would allow personal conveyance, and that one would be acceptable. Now, here are some things, personal conveyance that would not be permitted, and we need to be really careful here because some of these are now restricting types of personal conveyance that at one time in years past we might have allowed, thinking that it was still okay. The movement of a commercial motor vehicle in order to enhance the operational readiness of a motor carrier. For example, bypassing available resting locations. And remember, in the previous slide, we said it's okay to drive to the nearest safe resting spot. Bypassing available resting locations in order to get closer to the next loading or unloading point or other scheduled motor carrier destination. As an example, there's a motor carrier located in Marion County in the Salem area, but they quite often load out of a warehouse in Vancouver, Washington. Now, if the driver wanted to go off duty in Salem and drive toward his loading point the next morning, he might drive some distance and maybe get to the Portland area or maybe even into Vancouver and try and use that as personal conveyance. It would not be permitted, and that would be a pretty serious violation. He can't pass available resting locations in order to get closer to the next loading point. And in this example, assuming that he came from somewhere in Salem or south, he would have passed a rest area where hopefully there would have been parking space available and he could have taken his break right there. Another type that cannot be permitted is after delivering a towed unit and the towing unit no longer meets the definition of a commercial motor vehicle, the driver returns to the point of origin under the direction of the motor carrier to pick up another towed unit. Now, this might be shuttling trailers, but we can't go back and forth under personal conveyance just to pick up another load, basically. And the last one on this slide, continuation of a commercial motor vehicle trip in interstate commerce in order to fulfill a business purpose, including bobtailing or operating with an empty trailer in order to retrieve another load or reposition the tractor or trailer at the direction of the motor carrier. So in this case, we might be sent to another city in order to pick up a trailer or to load a trailer. Well, that is not allowed to be personal conveyance. We're under the direction of the motor carrier. We're not truly off duty at all. So these three items, and we'll look at some more now, these are areas that are not permitted for personal conveyance. And let's look at some more here. Time spent driving a passenger carrying commercial vehicle while the passengers are on board. We cannot use personal conveyance if we have passengers. Off-duty drivers are not considered passengers when they're traveling to a common destination of their own choice within the scope of this guidance. Any time spent transporting a commercial vehicle to a facility to have maintenance performed. This may be, at this time, one of the most frequently violated personal conveyance exceptions. Quite often, especially with owner-operators, that owner-operator has worked all week, for example, hauling freight, and now has the weekend to try and take care of any needed maintenance. Well, the drive from home or from a terminal to a maintenance facility is not considered personal conveyance. It would be considered a falsified log if it popped up in an audit. And the thing that we have to be really careful of is that if we have violated the personal conveyance rule in this example, we're maybe going from our home to a truck stop to have some work done. If we've done that on a Saturday or on a Sunday, which might be our only time to have work done on the truck, that may have been the period that we were trying to accomplish our 34-hour restart, so we wouldn't exceed the 70 or the 80-hour rule. Well, if we've interrupted that restart, then when we go to pick up our next load and begin trucking again, we may already be in violation of the 11 and the 14-hour rules or a 70-hour rule because we have messed with our restart. So no way can we drive to go have maintenance done on the truck. Even fueling the truck, we can't drive to a fuel spot and fill the truck with fuel and drive back. That would be on duty. And after being placed out of service for exceeding the maximum periods that are required under 395, time spent driving to a location to obtain required rest is not personal conveyance unless it's directed by an enforcement officer at the scene. So when we talk about the maximum periods permitted under Part 395, that would be our maximum driving rules. We can't drive more than 11 hours until we get 10 hours off. We can't drive after the 14th hour after we went on duty. And we can't drive after we've accumulated 60 hours in 7 consecutive days or 70 hours in 8 consecutive days. So if we happen to be stopped and that violation is discovered at the roadside, we're out of service. And we cannot move under personal conveyance unless the enforcement officer has allowed that movement. And a little more, time spent traveling to a motor carrier's terminal after loading or unloading from a shipper or a receiver. Once you've picked up the load, you're under load and you're on duty, and you can't use that time for personal conveyance. And any time spent operating a motor coach when the luggage is stowed, passengers have disembarked, and the driver's been directed to deliver the luggage. That is still on-duty time. So we have quite a few restrictions on when we can use personal conveyance. But the few that we do have that are allowed can be extremely helpful to a driver and to the company if they're used properly, and there won't be any risk then of some penalties afterward. So what I'd like to do now, we've gone through the guidance. This is the guidance that was published in the Federal Register, and we've covered it. But I'd like to share some experience that we've had here in our process of auditing logs for several motor carriers. And when we're looking at the ELD systems, we see some issues. Even though ELDs are so good in so many ways, it's still possible to make mistakes, and it is still possible to try and take some shortcuts with them. So we would encourage you, if you're auditing your own ELD systems, to consider some of this information. First, there are 3 critical reports. There's a lot of data that you can look at and learn from and use from an ELD. But 3 very critical reports you should always be looking at. And you should be looking at these driver's logs at the ELD systems at least on a monthly basis. And because it's all electronic and with your login, you can see daily logs, you can see what's going on right now. Daily reviews of certain drivers' activity would probably be a good idea. But we've got 3 reports that can be very helpful. The first is the hours of service violations. And no matter what ELD you're using, what system you're using, there is a means to look at a list of the violations. You can do it daily, monthly, weekly. Take a look at those violations and then go to those logs and take a look at the severity. What has really happened that caused that violation? We're seeing quite frequently that it may only be 1 or 2 or 3 minutes late, and now we've got a violation. The driver may have come back from his 10-hour break, but he may have come back and gone on duty 1 or 2 or 3 minutes before 10 hours had expired. We have to watch for those because they can be very serious even though they're such minor amounts of time. Now, it's our understanding today that at the roadside, if your driver is stopped and if he's in violation of the driving rules, the 11 or the 14 or the 60 or 70, if he's in violation of those, any one of those rules, and the violation is less than 15 minutes, that would be called a nominal violation. And the word nominal will appear on your DOT profile. If you're watching your profile and watching for any violations, you'll see a violation, for example, for a 14-hour rule. But then it may say nominal violation, and that means that it was less than 15 minutes over the 14th hour. Now, the policy at this time with the US DOT is that if it's a nominal violation, less than 15 minutes, then the point value for the violation will only be 1 point. If it were not nominal, let's say it's a 16-minute lapse, then you'd be assigned 7 points for a 14-hour violation. So this helps the motor carrier a little bit. You still have a violation on your record, and you still have a penalty, but the penalty is only 1 point instead of 7. So if you're seeing these, it's good to be aware of them. And you'll pick them up, even though it's 1, 2, 3 minutes, you'll pick them up on your violation report when you audit logs. Now, at the roadside, there is that little cushion where they call it nominal. However, if someone comes into your company to do a formal compliance review representing the US DOT or a state agency such as the Oregon DOT or the Washington State Patrol, if they come in to do a formal compliance review, their policy is to count every violation, and it won't be called nominal. So we have serious issues when we have drivers that are missing by 1 or 2 or 3 minutes, which means that you have to have a very strict and tightly controlled ELD operation. Drivers, there has to be some sort of system of corrective action, retraining, whatever it might take, but the drivers have to be more careful with these, what they think are minute violations and not very important. And we unfortunately have been thinking the same way, but we can no longer do that. A driver could actually have several 14-hour violations, none of which even added up to a total of 15 minutes for all of them. But that number of violations could put your safety rating at risk. So please watch the violations for the 11, the 14, the 60 or 70-hour rule. The other thing that they're always watching for is the required rest breaks. So the driver cannot, as I said earlier, cannot come back from a 10-hour break in less than 10 hours. Now, if you've got a system that meets all the requirements, the driver should be getting warnings of this. It's not a surprise to them that they've suddenly gone over 14 hours. It's not a surprise to them that they took their 30-minute rest break in only 27 minutes. They should be getting warnings. And what this means is the drivers have to do a lot more planning than they ever have before, trying to anticipate where they might be when they need to stop and try and anticipate what kinds of traffic problems, for example, might interfere. So we have to watch for that 10-hour break. We have to make sure that the 30-minute break is taken within no later than the 8th hour after the driver went on duty. Now, if a driver happens to have a really long day and decides to take the 30-minute break very early in the day, then we have to watch and make sure that the driver took a second break, because it's every 8 hours. So in the violations report, we're looking for violations of the 30-minute break, the 10-hour rest period, the 11, the 14, and the 60 or 70-hour maximum driving limits. And we always have to be watching for possible violations that really were done by falsifying the log, and there are still possibilities there. We have to be aware of it. The second report that's extremely important is the report that deals with unassigned hours or miles. And when we see this, what we have here is that the computer has continued to record activity on the truck, but it can't be assigned to a given driver. Now, this is an area we have the right, under the rules in Part 395, we have the right to edit logs. And if we can determine who was at the wheel, who was responsible for those unassigned times, then we can edit and add that to the log. So the important thing here is to be monitoring it and watching for the monthly reports or weekly reports, and then you have to investigate who was really operating that truck and then edit. And that can take care of those types of problems. Now, of course, when you've edited, you also have to go back then and make sure that that didn't create a violation. If it did, then we had a driver running unassigned trying to hide a violation in some cases. And the third one to audit for would be personal conveyance. And your ELD system should permit you to actually look at a report of everyone who used personal conveyance by date. And then you can go in and look at every one of them yourself, or if time doesn't permit, at least spot check the ones that look to be extremely high, extremely long, because there may be some abuses there. So please use the hours of service violations report, the unassigned hours and miles, and personal conveyance. Those are reports that are in the ELD system, and they're extremely helpful to you. So something you may want to watch with personal conveyance is the fact that you do have the coordinates, the compass coordinates. And because the rule says that the town will be listed only when it's a town of 5,000 or more population, and then the distances are measured from city centers. So in some cases, you may see a reading for a point that might be something like this, 2.3 miles south of Vancouver, Washington. Well, on the surface, you wouldn't know what that is, but it may be a factor in trying to figure out exactly where it is, because that's where the driver happened to be using personal conveyance. So then you'd have to go to the coordinates, and you can do that by going online, and it doesn't take too long. And the coordinate in the case that I'm using as an example is actually Jubit's truck stop in Portland, Oregon. You might not know that just trying to look at the coordinates and the description on the ELD. So now you know exactly where the driver physically parked, and then you can make your decision as to whether or not he should or should not have been using personal conveyance on that particular moment. We also encourage you in your audit process to obtain scale crossing records, and you can obtain them very easily from Oregon. Oregon makes it very simple. If you have an Oregon DOT account, and if you're running in Oregon, you should certainly have the account because that's how you pay your weight mile tax. And the account number and then a password that you use to get into your own account is all you need. And then you can search and select a program called OSCAR, OSCAR. And when you select OSCAR, that is the scale crossing report. And you can request it by month. We would encourage you to use those scale crossing records to occasionally match against your driver logs and make sure that the driver is where the scale says he was. The scale crossing reports will come out in an Excel or PDF format, and they will show you the scale number, the location of the scale, and the direction the driver was traveling, and the time of day and the date. An excellent tool in just monitoring driver activity. You can get the same data from the state of Washington, but it's a little bit more involved. In fact, it gets quite involved, and it takes sometimes a week or two to get the reports. Oregon is instant. Washington could take several days. If this is something you're not doing and you'd like to do that, please let someone at Glowstone know sometime after we're finished today, and we can email you a set of instructions for both states on how to get your scale crossings. Also, we encourage you to match other supporting documents to your logs. When we travel through the country trucking, we're delivering freight, we're leaving a paper trail you wouldn't believe. We've got receipts for fuel. We cross scales. We buy permits. We pay for the right to run on a turnpike. We pay for lodging. We have bills of lading. We leave time and date documents all along the trail, and the DOT will always have these when they come in to perform an audit. We should have them first, and we should be using them to monitor and make sure our drivers are following all the rules and not putting us or themselves at any risk by not having accurate logs. So the audit system, we're encouraging you to do this if you're not already, and it is time consuming. It does take you time. In fact, I have to admit that it's much easier to audit paper logs. It's so simple. But remember, we're dealing with paper logs in 15-minute increments. And in 15-minute increments, you can slop over a little bit on either side, and nobody will really notice it. It's not that important. So the 1 and 2 and 3 minute violations don't mean anything because they're not even evident. We're in a world now where everything's counted by minutes, and 1 minute can be a violation. So we need to pay more attention than we ever have, in my opinion, to audit our logs. If that's something you'd rather not do, you can certainly call Glowstone, and we can certainly make arrangements for someone to be able to help you audit your logs. So just to recap here, the paper logs are recording time in 15-minute increments, and it's not always precise. The ELD is 1 minute. ELD violations may occur when drivers are early or late for a specific requirement, only by 1 or 2 minutes. The roadside violation will be nominal if it's less than 15 minutes. Your points will be lower. However, safety investigators will write violations in DOT audit processes, even though it may be 1 or 2 or 3 minutes. It doesn't mean that will always happen. By the way, there are some auditors who just in their own style will let things go because they just don't see that it's that important as it relates to highway safety. But they have to follow their policy and their rule, and the rule says if you're 1 minute late, you have a violation. So please be aware of that and try and be as strict as you can to avoiding even the 1 and 2 minute violations. The unassigned hours, result of improper driver training or innocent key input error. Quite often we see drivers who have been put into an ELD system and not properly trained. And unassigned hours or miles can occur very innocently because the driver didn't know what to do and what key to strike. In many cases, going through any of the reports, you're going to see an opportunity for more training. The driver isn't trying to break any rules, but they just don't know. However, the unassigned hours, as I mentioned earlier, is a strong potential for falsifying driving time. You can edit unassigned time if the correct activity and correct driver can be determined. Personal conveyance. Check carefully for load destinations, loading points, layover points when you're reviewing. Use the coordinates if necessary to determine if the load was advanced under personal conveyance. The coordinates, now not all of you have the same system. In some cases, the coordinates are printed automatically right on the face of the log, right below the grid. In some cases, you may have to use a search tool, depending on the type of ELD you're using. But once you have those coordinates, you can copy and paste them in a search box, and they'll go right to the location. They'll even give you, in some cases like Google Maps, they'll actually give you a photo of that coordinate. And when I used the example of Jubit's truck stop, I was actually looking at that set of coordinates, trying to figure out where a driver was. And when we put that in and looked for the coordinates, we saw a photo of the Jubit's complex. Using PC to travel to a point where truck maintenance is performed is not permitted, and we can't say that frequently enough because it's so frequently violated. The driver has to be on duty, has to be in the driving mode when he's going to truck maintenance locations. In some cases, the driver will pass a safe place to stop in order to cover more miles. We had a situation where a driver going north passed the truck stop at mile 57 in Toledo, Washington, and went on 20 miles further. That would be a violation because he could have very easily stopped at Toledo, and he had a safe place to park and stay overnight. Well, that covers what we wanted to share with you today. I hope this has been helpful to all of you, and it may have prompted some questions. So at this point, if we can, we'll try and answer any questions that you might have.
Yes, and again, thank you, John, for speaking today. There's a lot of great information, a lot of great examples today. I know right now no one's typed in any questions. I'm going to unmute everybody and hopefully, I don't know if anybody actually signed up to have their audio going, but one question did pop up. What about personal conveyance used for visiting family?
That's well, I'm glad you asked that. You've really got me on the spot here. Let's assume that family isn't at your home. It isn't at any place you would typically go with the truck. If you go to visit family and you can take your layover at that point, that would certainly be allowable. It would be the same as going home or going to a safe place to take a layover. So if you're going there and you can visit your family and have 10 consecutive hours off duty, I think that would be permitted. To go and visit for a while and maybe have dinner and then get back in the truck and drive some more to another place and continue on personal conveyance would be questionable.
Yeah, that was a good question. Are there any other questions out there? I know there's a lot of changes, a lot of he said thanks, or the person said thanks, so that was a good answer,
Great.
John.
Great.
I'll give you guys maybe like another 15, 20 seconds to type up another question. I will say we're going to be having more topics down the road in the coming months. If you have any suggestions I see another question in just a second, but if you have any questions or any ideas on topics for 2019's webinar series, feel free to write it in the chat box when I send you the email on Monday with the presentation and the link to this recording. Feel free to reply to that email and let me know what topics that you would like us to cover in 2019, and we can put that on our calendar and our list. We did get another question. Can you deadhead home after dropping off a load?
Yes, you can if you're going home. Now, where you might have a little bit of a problem is if you're going home and it's in the direction of your next load. So if you're deadheading home with the trailer and you're going to go most of the distance toward your next load by going home, that could be questionable. These things aren't cut and dried yet. We don't have any case history for them. I'm tempted because I believe in trying to take advantage of the rule if we can do it legally. I would say that you're deadheading and you can go home. Now, I think that your question may have come about because you might be familiar with how the rule was for years, and the interpretation said you could use the personal conveyance if you weren't laden, if there was no load. They've removed that restriction. So you could actually, in some cases, go home with the load on. However, if you're just headed down the road toward where you intend to deliver, that could be construed as simply advancing the load, and it wouldn't be off duty. And I'm sorry I'm not giving you a more clear answer. Deadheading, though, I'd be comfortable saying you can do that with no trouble.
And I'll allow one more question if they pop up. I guess on a side note, another thing. So we just finished up our January trucking safety and regulatory conference here in Portland, Portland, Oregon. And if you have not if you didn't register for the conference, or if you want to check out the video, the presentation recordings, we had about 7 different presentations on various regulatory compliance issues. We had the FMCSA there. A lot of great information. You can go to our website and check out our resource page, our library, and it'll have all of the past webinars we've done in the last 2 years, and the conferences and the conference videos that we've done in the last 3 years. So we've got a lot of great free information online. I don't see any more questions, so I'm fine. I don't want to spend more time on here with everybody else's time. It's Friday. Go home. We thank you all for joining us. If you ever do have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us at Glowstone, and we can try to help answer any of your questions. Expect an email on Monday with the recording of this presentation and the presentation slides. The recording is John goes into so much great detail that the slides don't cover. So I would say check out the presentation recording. Send that recording out to others if you find value in that, and help spread the word. We want to help people stay in compliance. So with that, thank you, John, for joining us today. Thank you,
welcome.
everybody, to join us on this first webinar of our 2019 series, and looking to hopefully have you guys join us for more down the road. And with that, I'm going to wrap up the webinar. Thank you all again for joining us.